Smoke clung to the valley like a low-gray tide, curling around the burned-out frames of vehicles and the shattered bones of a weapons depot that had been hit only hours earlier. The air tasted of metal and ash. Lieutenant Ryan Carter moved through the wreckage with quiet precision. Garmin Foratrex strapped to his wrist, his voice steady as he called coordinates into the Singar's handset clipped to his vest. His platoon spread out behind him. The 2nd Platoon of Bravo Company. Unost Battalion. 25th Infantry Regiment. Methodically clearing what was left. Their boots crunched over debris. Rifle ready. Every sound amplified by the silence that followed the storm. Carter's M4, A1, hung low against his chest. Safety on. Barrel blackened from earlier firefights. He felt the dull ache of exhaustion behind his eyes, but forced his mind to stay sharp. The men were following routine now, scanning for intel, cataloging whatever hadn't been reduced to scrap. Sergeant Luke Briggs barked short updates through the comms. His voice edged with fatigue. Private First Class Logan Price moved between burned vehicles, his movement quick. Too nervous for Carter's liking. The younger soldiers still carried the tremor of adrenaline that never quite faded after the fight. They reached the cluster of detainees near a twisted Humvee. Most were shaking, dust-covered, murmuring in low voices. Then Carter saw her. Among them stood a woman, hands sip-teed, posture straight as a rod. Her uniform looked too clean, her face streaked only with soot around the edges. A faint insignia caught the light beneath her collar, a raven beside a single star. She wasn't pleading or crying like the others. She simply stared toward the northwest ridge. Her gray eyes locked on a distant line where the platoon's M777 howitzers were parked. Price muttered that she was too clean to be local. Briggs gave a short laugh, but didn't sound convinced. Carter studied her longer, the discipline in her stillness setting his instincts on edge. Her calm wasn't fear. It was focus. He glanced toward the ridge she watched. Feeling a low unease settle in his chest, something about her composure didn't belong here. The smoke, the silence, and her steady eyes turned the valley into something colder than victory. He adjusted the strap on his rifle and called to Briggs to keep her separated. The battle was over, but the way she stared made him think something else was just beginning. The air inside the command tent was thick and dry, carrying the faint smell of fuel from the generators outside. The canvas walls shivered every few seconds, with the low hum of machinery, and static from the Singar's radio bled into the background like restless whispers. Lieutenant Ryan Carter sat at a folding table beneath the flicker of a single lantern. His sleeves rolled to the elbows, the weight of the day still heavy in his eyes. Across from him, the woman sat perfectly still, her wrists bound in front of her, her gaze resting somewhere beyond him. She didn't blink much. She didn't flinch either. Her calm wasn't defiance. It felt more like calculation. Carter's tone stayed even, professional. Each word measured. He asked her name, where she came from, if she understood English. The silence between his questions stretched long enough for the radio to fill it with soft bursts of static. She didn't move, didn't react. Sergeant Luke Briggs stood near the tent flap, arms crossed, watching with the impatience of a man who'd seen too many interrogations end the same way. He muttered that intel should handle her. Carter ignored it. Something about her stillness unsettled him more than any protest would have. A few feet away, Corporal Mason Hill entered the tent, holding a tablet under one arm, his eyes sharp behind a layer of dust. He paused when he noticed her boots. Standard issue, Belleville, 790 secondes. Tan leather scuffed at the toes, but still intact. The kind the Army stopped issuing years ago. He crouched slightly, studying the laces. They were tied in an over-under ranger knot. The way they taught you in basic, no villager knew how to tie them that way. He glanced up at Carter. His expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Carter saw it too, but said nothing. The lieutenant leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, voice steady but lower now. He asked again who she was, why she was watching their ridge. The woman's eyes flicked once toward the map pinned to the table. Then, with slow precision, she lifted one restrained hand and tapped twice near the contour lines, marking the northwest ridge. The sound was small, but it cut through the room like a trigger snap. Briggs frowned. Irritation, hiding unease. Hill whispered that it looked like a warning. Carter didn't answer. He just watched her hand fall back into her lap, his mind turning over the sound of those two quiet taps and what they might mean. The generator outside buzzed again, steady and low, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. Night settled over the camp like a heavy blanket, thick with humidity and the faint smell of oil and smoke. The generators droned somewhere beyond the tents, steady and low, their hum mixing with distant thunder rolling through the valley. Inside the command tent, Lieutenant Ryan Carter leaned over a small desk lit by a single red lamp, reviewing after-action reports. His eyes burned from exhaustion, the kind that came after too many hours of command decisions and not enough certainty. Outside, the guards kept their patrols quiet, moving past the holding area where the woman sat, still bound, still silent. It was close to 2:30 a.m. when the first sign of trouble came. Delta Colme. The recon element missed its scheduled check-in. Carter's radio operator called their frequency twice, his voice tightening with each unanswered transmission. Only static came back. Carter felt the air shift, that strange instinct soldiers learn to trust after too many missions gone sideways. Before he could speak, Private First Class Logan Price appeared at the tent flap, pale and breathless. He said the woman was doing something odd, tapping on the metal pole that held up her tent. Short taps, long pauses, over and over. Carter and Sergeant Briggs followed him in. The woman sat cross-legged on the ground, her eyes distant, tapping the same pattern against the pole. Price whispered that it was Morse code, something his father had taught him from his old Signal Corps days. The word she was repeating was Delta. The tapping stopped, and for the first time, she spoke. Her accent was clean, American, unmistakable. She said if Carter sent more men up the northern road, they'd be dead in 20 minutes. Briggs scoffed, calling it a bluff. Carter didn't answer. He watched her as she reached for the map, took the pencil, and drew with calm precision 2 machine gun nests with overlapping fire lanes, a narrow pass for the ambush, and a dry riverbed that cut around it. Carter's stomach tightened as he realized her marks matched the terrain he'd scouted earlier. Against every instinct drilled into him, he made the call. The QRF rerouted through the riverbed. Minutes later, the radio came alive with gunfire and a broken voice. Contact north. Then silence. The seconds dragged until the voice returned, gasping but clear. Delta extracted. Enemy neutralized. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Carter looked toward the woman. She didn't smile. She just closed her eyes and exhaled, whispering that it was one less name on the wall. The camp had gone quiet after the incident with Delta 3. The only sounds left were the faint buzz of the generator outside and the occasional crack of thunder echoing across the valley. Inside the command tent, Corporal Mason Hill sat alone, the glow of the Sipper terminal painting his face in shifting blue light. His curiosity wouldn't let him sleep. He kept thinking about the small insignia he'd seen under the woman's collar, the raven beside a single star. It wasn't standard issue. It was something older, something hidden. He logged into the secure Army database, typing the details carefully. The system scrolled through layers of classified archives until one entry appeared: Wolf Nove. Experimental Sniper Unit. Status Kia. Operation Black Glacier. Hill leaned closer, reading the redacted file summaries. The text was clinical, written in the cold rhythm of military record-keeping. All personnel presumed killed in action during extraction failure. He clicked an attached image. The photo was black and white, slightly blurred from years of compression. The woman in the picture stared back with the same steady eyes he'd seen in the tent. The caption read, "Captain Elena Monroe, Commanding Officer. Wolf 9. Hill's stomach dropped. He froze, staring at the screen. Unsure whether to feel awe or fear, he grabbed the tablet, its surface still warm, and hurried to Carter's quarters. Sergeant Briggs was already there, half awake and irritable until he saw the look on Hill's face. Carter took the tablet, eyes narrowing as he read. The photo said everything. The silent prisoner sitting in their camp wasn't a rebel, wasn't even a civilian. She was one of theirs. A soldier thought to be dead. Carter said nothing. He stepped out of the tent and looked across the camp to where her lantern flickered through the canvas. Her shadow sat perfectly still, her head bowed slightly, calm in a way that now felt heavier than before. The same calm he'd mistaken for stubbornness was something else entirely. It was discipline, control, the mark of someone who'd seen more than any of them could imagine. A rumble of thunder rolled through the valley as realization set in. She wasn't a captive or a threat. She was a ghost. The ghost of Wolf 9. The morning light came slow and gray, pushing through the haze that hung over the valley. The camp was still half asleep when the sound of engines began to roll in from the east. It wasn't the uneven rumble of civilian trucks or the light thrum of a supply convoy. This was deeper, heavier, a synchronized rhythm of power. The sentries in the towers lifted their binoculars and froze. Through the mist, a line of matte black GMVs advanced, their headlights off, moving in perfect formation. Carter stepped outside, tightening his vest as the tension rippled through the camp. Unknown vehicles, no markings, no radio calls. He ordered the men to hold fire. The engines idled for a moment, then shut off at once, leaving only the wind and the creak of metal cooling. The doors opened in unison. A dozen soldiers stepped out, each in black fatigues with night vision mounts folded up on their helmets. M4, A, one carbine slung with suppressors attached. Their formation was exact. Not a word spoken. Not a movement wasted. Every man in Bravo Company knew what that kind of discipline meant, whoever they were. They weren't regular army. Carter moved forward, signaling his platoon to stay ready, but low. From the lead vehicle, a tall figure stepped out. His hair was silver at the edges, his face lined but sharp. He walked with the steady bearing of command, his uniform stripped of unit patches, except for a single subdued rank insignia. He stopped a few feet from Carter and spoke his name. Colonel Thomas Shaw, U.S. Army Special Operations Command. The words hit like a charge. Briggs whispered from behind that this had to be Ghost Division, the kind of unit most soldiers only heard about in stories. Schaff didn't look at him. His eyes scanned the camp until they locked on the woman standing outside the holding tent. She had been brought out for movement, wrists still bound, posture straight as ever. For the first time since her capture, her eyes softened. Recognition flickered between them like a signal. Shaw straightened fully, heels together, and saluted. "Captain Monroe," he said. The air fell silent. Every soldier froze. Carter's hand lowered from his weapon as the realization spread through the ranks. The prisoner they had mocked, questioned, doubted she wasn't the enemy. She was one of their own, a legend walking out of the shadows. The ghost of Wolf 9 had come home. The storm outside was beginning to break when Colonel Thomas Shaw spread a tactical map across the table. The command tent smelled of rain and fuel, the canvas walls trembling with each gust of wind. Lieutenant Ryan Carter stood to his right, Sergeant Luke Briggs to his left, and Captain Elena Monroe sat silently across from them, her eyes steady on the map. Shaw's tone was calm, but carried the weight of years. He said the name that had haunted classified circles for 2 years, Operation Black Glacier. He traced his finger across the topographic lines on the map, stopping at a narrow pass marked with faded grid coordinates. Wolf 9 had been sent here, he explained, for an extraction mission. The target was a civilian scientist carrying proof of a banned bioweapon program. It was supposed to be quick, clean, but within an hour, the mission turned into a slaughter. Their comms were jammed, every escape route sealed, and air support delayed until it was useless. Carter leaned closer as Shaw continued, his voice tightening. It hadn't been an ambush. It had been a setup. Colonel Raymond Voss, Joint Special Operations Oversight, had ordered the operation himself. When the scientist refused to hand over the research, Voss called for a cleanup. He couldn't risk exposure of a U.S. sanctioned experiment, so he sent private contractors to intercept and destroy the unit. He turned American artillery against American soldiers. 16 men and women died in less than an hour. Shaw's hand lingered over the map where Wolf 9 had made their last stand. He said Monroe's name softly. She was the only survivor. Officially, she died in the blast. Unofficially, she disappeared before they could finish the job. The silence hung heavy after that. Briggs muttered that it couldn't be true. But even his voice faltered. Carter stared at Monroe, realization settling hard in his chest. The quiet woman they had doubted, restrained, and questioned, had been fighting their war long before they met her. Shaw said she'd been tracking Voss's shadow network across the region, exposing the corruption he buried under layers of classified orders. Her capture wasn't a mistake. She'd walked into the trap on purpose to stop it from happening again. Carter's throat felt dry. He looked at her, seeing not a ghost, but a soldier who had carried truth alone through years of silence. Shaw's voice softened as he said Voss's next target had been Carter's artillery position. A repeat of the same cover story. Monroe finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. She said she didn't come back for revenge. She came back to make sure no one else ended up as another name on a wall. The tent went still, and for a long time, the only sound was the storm passing through the valley. The first mortar hit at 3 o'clock, splitting the night open with a flash of white light and a wall of sound that rolled through the camp like thunder. Lieutenant Ryan Carter was thrown from his cot as the tent shook, dirt and canvas raining down in a choking wave. The sirens wailed a heartbeat later, and the base erupted into motion. Soldiers sprinted through the smoke, pulling on plate carriers, strapping helmets, grabbing rifles from racks that clattered under frantic hands. The air was thick with confusion and the raw pulse of survival. Someone shouted over the comms about incoming rounds, their voice drowned by the next explosion. The command post filled with overlapping noise. Radios screamed for grid updates. Squad leaders barked orders, and the low crack of small arms fire began to blend with the rising chaos. Carter pushed through it all, disoriented, but trying to regain command structure. Then a voice cut through the confusion, firm and clear. Captain Elena Monroe was already outside, her uniform streaked with soot. Scanning the horizon between impacts, she listened, counting seconds under her breath. Every detonation landed closer. She shouted for the men near the motor pool to move, her voice sharp with urgency. Seconds later, a mortar round tore through the fuel tanks, the blast throwing fire into the sky. She didn't flinch. She was already recalculating. Monroe sprinted toward the comms post, ducking behind sandbags as another impact shook the ground. She grabbed the AN, divided by PRC 117G radio, and switched to the Overwatch frequency. Raven 3. Echo by. Fire mission on my mark. The operator hesitated, eyes wide. That call sign was supposed to be dead, buried with Wolf 9. But Overwatch responded immediately, voice steady and professional. Awaiting her grid, Monroe pulled a grease pencil from her pocket and leaned over the dirt-smeared map. Sierra 5 through Sierra 8. Walking barrage north to south. Fire for effect. The first outgoing rounds from the M777 howitzers on the ridge arrived 30 seconds later. The ground shook with the concussive rhythm of precise fire. each explosion walking across the distant hillside where the enemy's guns were hidden. Monroe moved between foxholes, checking, firing sectors, and adjusting fields of fire. SAW gunners shifted positions to cover gaps while rifle teams worked in pairs, clearing breaches along the wire. Her calm turned the panic into order. Even Sergeant Briggs, who had once doubted every word she said, followed her commands without hesitation. By the time the last mortar fell silent, the night had begun to pale into morning. The smell of burning metal mixed with wet dust and cordite. Soldiers leaned against barriers, eyes red, hands shaking. But alive, the ridge ahead glowed faintly, with the wrecks of enemy trucks burning in the dawn light. Carter stood beside the Monroe, watching the smoke drift toward the horizon. She said nothing. Her uniform was torn, her face blackened, but her gaze stayed fixed on the valley she had saved. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Carter gave a quiet nod. One soldier's recognition of another. The woman they had once bound in silence had become the voice that saved them all. The battle ended with the sunrise. Smoke drifted low over the valley, thick and gray, blurring the outlines of the camp that was now half in ruins. The metallic scent of gunfire lingered in the air, mingling with the faint hiss of burning canvas. Soldiers moved slowly through the wreckage, their movements heavy but purposeful. Some carried the wounded. Others searched for missing gear among the debris. The chaos had burned itself out, leaving only the hollow quiet that follows survival. In the middle of the camp stood Captain Elena Monroe. Her uniform was torn at the shoulder, streaked with soot and dust. The faint light of morning caught the edge of her name tape, the letters darkened by smoke. Her posture was straight, her face expressionless, though exhaustion etched every line around her eyes. Across the yard, Colonel Thomas Shaw approached, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He stopped a few paces from her, studied her for a moment, and came to attention. Then, in perfect silence, he raised his hand and saluted. Carter was the next to move. His chest still tight from adrenaline and disbelief, he came to attention beside Shaw and lifted his hand, the motion instinctive, his throat dry. One by one, the others followed. Privates, sergeants, medics, engineers, all the men and women who had once doubted her, stood in the dust and smoke, saluting the woman who had led them through the fire. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the wind moving across the scorched ground. Monroe returned the salute slowly, her hand steady, despite the tremor of fatigue in her wrist. Around Hare, the shattered camp stood still, transformed by a single act of unity. In that silence, a legend was born. Carter lowered his hand and watched her, realizing the truth that would stay with him for life. Leadership wasn't about volume or rank. It was about the strength to stand calm in the storm. The silence that filled the valley carried both grief and gratitude, binding every survivor to the ghost who had walked among them and led them home. Weeks later, the world felt quieter. The war had slowed. The sounds of engines and artillery, replaced by the calm hum of ordinary life. At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the parade ground stretched wide under a soft morning light. Rows of soldiers stood in perfect formation, their dress uniforms pressed, their faces solemn. The air carried the faint scent of polish and dew. A black cloth covered the bronze memorial at the front of the platform, its edges rippling gently in the breeze. When it was lifted away, the surface caught the sunlight, revealing 16 engraved names. The soldiers of Wolf 9. The ceremony moved with measured precision. Brass instruments played a slow hymn, each note echoing across the field like a memory. A row of folded flags sat on a velvet table, their corners sharp, untouched. The crowd stood in silence. No words spoken. No movement, but the quiet shift of boots against concrete. Captain Elena Monroe stood at the front of the formation. Her uniform was crisp, ribbons neat but restrained. Her posture unwavering. She kept her eyes on the plaque. Her expression calm but unreadable. A general stepped forward, holding a medal in a small presentation case. He spoke softly, his words about courage and sacrifice drifting across the still air. When he offered it to her, she shook her head and reached out instead to take it. For a moment, she looked down at the medal, then placed it gently at the base of the plaque. "It belongs with them," she said. No applause followed. Only the wind moved. Brushing against the flags and the polished bronze, Lieutenant Ryan Carter stood a few rows back, his hands clasped behind his back. Watching her, he realized that her silence had changed everything. Not through orders or speeches, but through example. The sun rose higher, gleaming over the names carved forever into the plaque. Below them, the inscription read simply, "For truth, for honor, for those forgotten." The ceremony was over. The rows of soldiers had dispersed, and the parade ground stood silent again. Only the faint rustle of flags broke the stillness, their edges fluttering softly in the Carolina wind. Lieutenant Ryan Carter remained by the bronze plaque, staring at the engraved names as sunlight traced along the letters. The morning had lost its formality, leaving behind something quieter, heavier, and more human. A few steps away, Captain Elena Monroe stood alone. Her hands were clasped behind her back, her eyes fixed on the names of Wolf 9. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of worn metal. It was her old identification tag, marked with the raven and the single star that once defined her unit. She turned to Carter and pressed it into his hand. "Keep it," she said softly, a reminder that the quiet ones are usually the ones who have seen the most. The tag was cool against his palm, heavier than it looked. When he looked up to speak, she was already walking away. Carter watched her cross the open field, her figure fading between the rows of flags. The wind caught her uniform slightly, the sunlight glinting off her shoulder, insignia before she disappeared into the distance. He looked back at the plaque one last time, reading the inscription beneath the names. For truth, for honor, for those forgotten. The words carried a different meaning now. Not just carved metal, but a promise. The silence that lingered no longer felt empty. It felt sacred, filled with the presence of those who had stood, fought, and never returned. Carter closed his hand around the tag and understood that Monroe's story was not hers alone. It belonged to every soldier who carried the burden of quiet courage. Some heroes leave footprints in history. Others leave silence that speaks louder than any medal.